Hello, this is going to be diving into internet game programming and what I've done this past couple weeks. We are going to ignore the UI stuff because next week with game object hierarchies, the UI will get exponentially better. So I won't worry about that this week, but we will be going over some of the changes that I have made. So I think the best one to start with is events. I added two more methods called unregister listener and unregister all listeners. Both of these, one unique thing about my game is that I'm adding and removing components to game objects. So a lot of the time I need to I need to be able to unregister events because of this. And I'll show you an example of what with this. So if we Control Shift F for my auto target, when I end my auto target action, I am still listening for events because the auto target action component can still run. So what was happening was I listened for events for trying to see if an enemy can be targeted or a player can be targeted. Or when I do a new auto target action component, I re-listen for these events because these are in the start. So a lot of the time, it isn't the greatest because what's happening is I'm instantiating, removing. So what I had to do was I had to remove all events that were listening for this game object. This is just one example of what was done in order to alleviate this. Now let's look at auto target action components a little bit more closely now. There's a lot of changes to my auto target stuff, so it should be good to reference these changes. So with my auto target action component, I now have changed something. So let's go this, Control Shift F. So let's look at like Whirlwind, for example. Initially, the Whirlwind action component, and I can even go to GitHub. Initially, the Whirlwind action component was different. I had to do a little bit of logic prior to establishing it. So it is. So if we look at our it's called Whirlwind. Prior to doing this, what I had to do was I had to set this dot targets equal to yourself, which is this dot game object, and then select this dot current target equals this dot targets, and then this dot change selected enemy to be yourself. I changed all that to be this only self select equal true. So now what I do is every single action component now has a let's just say a flag where we can select players, we can select enemies, and we can select self. What this does is it determines which events I can listen to. If I can select players, I can do my enemy target. If I can select enemies, I'll listen for the enemy can be targeted event. If I can select players, I can listen for the players can be targeted. If I can only select self, I don't listen for events. I just push this .game object, select the current game object to this, and then do this. So what I do is I just generalized it even further. So, yeah. So that's always nice. So now I don't need to do those 3 lines. All I need to do is if I can target self, I can do that. One example of this would be heal self. With heal self, you can only heal yourself. So this means that this dot only select self is true, and I just call start, super dot start, which is very, very useful, especially when selecting yourself is very common. I extended this to other auto-target action components like mass heal. So both of these I created over the break, and I can just briefly actually go through these. What I do is I basically say, I call this new event called update stats, which I'll explain later. And I select this .game object, current health, and health healing amount. And then this .fire projectiles equals true. And what this, and I don't think it will work right now because there was a bug, but we can even double check. So I think healing self is 6. Yeah, so there is a slight bug right now, but that's fine. Okay, but regardless, this will eventually update the stat of current health and then set this .fire projectile equal to true to then reset that. Same with this. You set this .fire equal projected to true, and then you loop through everything and you heal that amount. I also kind of adjusted some of the logic to just simplify it into more modular framework. Probably the most, I instead of doing select enemy, I now can select character because I can select teams now, or your player characters. So just a name convention. For end execution, I unregister all listeners, and then I call this action component .set stroke style. So inside of action component now, I have the static set stroke style where I basically say, hey, your character, which is your game object, if it is your current turn, if it is selected, or if it's targetable. If it's your current turn, you select set it equal to purple, otherwise blue, otherwise yellow. In this case, I have false on all of them, which means that it will be this color when it ends. I just basically reset it so that when I do something like this and select, but then cancel it, it reselects everything back to normal, which in this case is black. This means that it just makes everything a little bit easier. And then I also set this targets equal to null or a blank list. And then, yeah. The other thing that I kind of changed was, no, that's that. I think that is the main. I would say that these are the main things that I have done inside of my auto target action component. See, a lot of this stuff right now is pretty much just updating things to be more modular, a little bit more easier to understand, and that type of stuff, which I think you will definitely see more often. Okay, so now let's look at one final thing for auto target action component. So do I have, no, I don't. Okay. That should be it for auto target action component regarding what is changed. Again, there's a slight bug right now that I actually look at it with my healing and my mass heal. And I can probably debug it right now that I know what has changed. But when I do event on handling update stats, what's happening is that I am not listening for it. That is the issue. And that's because I'm pretty sure I changed how I do stats. So if we go to, pretty sure it's just a character component. Yeah, I just call update derived stats now, rather than that. So we can do that quick change as well, which should be useful. Because, for example, inside of my move, which works, I call update derived stats. So yeah, I'll show that quick change then. So what I'm going to do is, instead of doing event.handle event, since I'm only updating that, what I'll do is I'll do player.get component, and then I'll get the character component dot update derived stat, and it will be current health comma, and then instead of healing, instead of doing this dot remaining movement, it will be, it can't be healing amount because that will set it to that, but we can double check. So we can do a quick double check. So 6, my health is 20, and now it's 7. So what I need to do is so what I should do is I should get let player component equal player.get this. Now I do player component dot update derived stats, and then we also look at, or I should say character. Now inside of character component, what I have is get stat. So what I'll do is I will do, instead of this document, I'll do this character component dot get stat current health plus heal stat. And now if we do 7, or if we do 6, and we select those two and we click enter, now it is 27. Now we just have to copy and paste this logic from heal to this one. And we will even do this, and then let, we actually need to double check. It is just this document object. This document object, document component, character component, and then we do this. But instead of doing and a small little bug as well that I just found is that copy and paste error from before. But now we can do this, and we can say, we can remove this event handling. We can say now we get the character component, and then we update derived stats, current health, character component, get stats, current health, plus the healing amount. So now if I do 6, which is my mass healing, I can heal at 5, but if I do 5, which is my heal self, I know it doesn't set it. And so another small bug, but I will look at that later. These changes are good enough right now to give you the core idea of that. But yeah, okay. So now we kind of shown how to do healing and that stuff, which it's not changing the actual back end or the character stats, but that's something that I can fix later. Now let's look at just a couple more examples of how I've changed it. So now instead of doing, for example, character component. Yeah, so now instead of doing like for our slash component, I can just do this dot can select enemy characters equals true for that stuff now, instead of trying to do all this logic for, oh, you can target this one but not this one. So it definitely simplifies the start function, at least for a lot of the stuff. Okay, now let's look at some enemy component logic that has changed. A lot hasn't changed for enemy component logic, but I would say enough has that it can be nice to have. So I have started very, very basic logic for enemy behavior, but otherwise, the main thing I have done is on trigger enter. I've done damaging components now, so you can apply damage, which I think we've already have. But then there's also the enemy can be targeted stuff that we talked about earlier, which shall be good. So that's always nice. What else? Yeah, that I would say that is probably it for the enemy as of right now, as far as I can tell. So let's go back to character component, and this is where a lot of stuff has changed for my character. Just regarding kind of some of the logic that we need. So I'd argue that the first real thing that I did inside of what's it called? Character component is there has been a lot of logic regarding drive stats and status effects. So what I have now is I've implemented a system where I can apply buffs and debuffs to enemies and to players. So we can look at an example. And if we go into our scene, for our player square, what I do is I take status effects inside the constructor. So what I will do is I'll just do a new status effect, and I have this whole file there. And let's do the burn status effect. So let's look at that. It takes the duration and damage. So new burn effect, duration, let's say 5, and I take 5, let's say 2, and I take 5 damage. We will be able to see who takes that damage when they end their turn. So when we actually look at the burn status effect, there's this, let's look at parent status effect first. On status effect, it takes a constructor with a duration and name. It has an on start, on end, and modify stat value. So it has a lot of stuff where it can definitely help with like what we're going to modify and that stuff. But our burn status effect does a duration and damage. Super duration, this dot damage equals damage, and will eventually have to name, but name isn't as important right now. What happens though is on end turn, I have a character, and I just say character dot apply damage, this dot damage. So when this enters a turn, you see how I take 5 damage. That is because that's how much happens. But if I end my turn and loop around, I should take 5 damage again. But if I go again, I don't, because it only burns for 2 turns. We can apply to this with other status effects as well. So we have a speed debuff status effect. So instead of doing that, we do a speed debuff status effect. And say we need a duration and a percent. So let's say a duration, and let's say 5%. Let's do 50%. Well, you see now how he has he's not first anymore in this current initiative order that I have, which will be explained in the UI portion. So now when I end my turn though, I go to him, end my turn, go past it, end my turn. Now this is the second time. If I do now one more time, you see how he now goes back up in initiative order. So now that it's the end of the round. Now we actually go back to him now because his speed debuff was now removed. So it's just another way to test stuff and to apply like a more layered aspect to it. So now, say I have a spell like the fireball that I want a burn effect, I can do that now. That's just something that will be explored later. But now that is possible now with this status effect kind of logic that I have. And now finally, derived stats. For a character component, derived stats is something that is, I would say, very important. What happens with derived stats is that derived stats are stats. Since we have all these status effects, what's going to happen is that status effects will change what values will happen in like the actual output of the value. So what I am going to do, or what is happening, is that whenever we get a stat, instead of just getting the base stat, what I'm doing is I'm going to say, okay, get this specific stat. I'll loop through all the status effects and apply everyone that I need for that status, for that stat. So if I'm getting speed and I have a speed debuff, I will apply that speed debuff to the derived stats. And then I'll get that stat and then be able to use it. What this means is that, say, for example, later on, if we do items, when I do derived stats, I just loop through the items and say, now just apply those now with respect to your buffs and debuffs as well. So it's very, very modular system where I can just say, hey, give me this stat type of deal. So what happens now is that, say, with derived stats, what I do now is I derive stats current health equals just the getting stat for max health. And now that I actually think about it, that's probably why heal and self-heal don't work, is because I'm updating the derived stat, not the base stat. And honestly, this is still a work in progress theoretically, because there's a lot of stuff that I'm still tinkering out conceptually with how this will work. And like, when should I update the base stat versus when should I update the derived stat? But yeah. So what happens now though is that so now I have a constructor which does a super for the component. I get the stats for max health and max movement, and then I do the ability cooldown stuff as I've done before. I apply there's an apply damage function which just updates the derived stats. And then there's also the start turn logic, which will be called to do all the effects for when effect.on turn start. So for example, on speed debuff, I do modify stat, which isn't a debuff. So, but say on turn start, I take damage on my turn start, for example, or something happens, like I get teleported in a specific area or whatever. I can call this start turn logic, and then that status or whatever will be applied to say, like, I get an extra 5 health when it's my turn, for example. That will be a start turn logic where I apply that effect when it's my turn, and then when I end my turn, I remove that effect. Speaking of end turn, what I do is I reapply the logic of removing or subtracting 1 from a cooldown with a max of 0, and I do the status effects. I'm actually going to leave this. It's just a console actually. But yeah, so I do that, and then I also set the effect duration minus minus if there is an effect duration. I probably also need to do that on start as well, now that I actually look at it. But yeah. And then what I do then is or technically not, because it would still be in turn logic. But yeah, but then what I do is then I call the effect on in turn, and then I set the duration minus minus. And then I filter the status effects that only have a duration of greater than 0. I set priority to be false, and then I set the drive stat of remaining movement equal to the get the base stat of max movement. I also have some permanent updates, so like modify base stat, that type of thing. And then the get stat, which we already talked about, and update drive stat, which we already talked about. And then these are just the hovering of stuff. So if I hover over, I can see that those values that I need to like health range, which will be covered next week, because we are going to be doing a lot of UI stuff for next week. Okay. And I think you could probably tell now why it's going to be relatively hard to actually show you guys like the actual process of this due to the sheer amount of code that was done. So apologies for not kind of reorganizing that, but hopefully this is a good kind of rundown of everything. I think the next one I'd say is important is the turn manager component, probably. And there's some stuff with player component where now I do get stat instead of manually getting stats. But yeah, I'd say that for the most part, that the player component or the actually the player component, there's this one thing. I added a this dot can start turn, which in this case is inside of the character component, can start turn. And what happens is if you can start your turn, then you start your turn. And then when you end, you say, I'm pretty sure I set that equal to false somewhere. Let's see. Yeah, so as you start your turn, after you start your turn, so I call this dot start turn, I say this dot can start equals false, which I'm going to change that to be, it's fine right there. You could also put it inside of here, which would make a lot of sense, because after you start your turn, but enemy components may also have that. So, but overall, that's kind of the thing that changed. Also with the calling the this dot end turn. That is all for character component and player component. So I'd say next is turn manager component. There's a lot in here since I added the UI stuff. I added turn indicator UI and turn integral player. And a lot of this is just establishing the top, which will be established later. But there was one small kind of fix, like structurally, that now I have to do. Where since speed can be adjusted and speed affects UI, I had to readjust how I did it to where now I just call this start round, where I call all this logic. This will probably be more cleaner next week, but you can take a look at it with UI and I'll kind of get a way better understanding of this and explain it better next week when we do UI. But basically, it just reestablishes the initiative order at the top to reflect the initiative order that actually reflects the new speeds if a speed is adjusted. And now what I do is I just get the initiative list, which is established in the start round, and then do what we normally do where we wait for the player action or we do our enemy turn. When we wait for the player action, we get has priority character component in that stuff. And we can even simplify this since we don't reuse that. We can just do this. So now we have that and okay. And yep, that still works. And then we have our enter and handle events, the same common stuff. A lot of it is just the start turn logic now is implemented. Same with the turn order. We kind of had a lot of this stuff be the same. It's not, there isn't really that much change for my turn order manager component as well. So both of those are relatively UI changes that will be more explained further down. Is there any other? So now we just did some game object changes to reflect some of this stuff now. So like for example, like basic enemy game object now has their own stats now. Same thing with if we go to player character and player square character, they have a whole list of stuff now. So they have like your abilities, your base stats. I'll probably apply the same logic to player as I do enemy, so that I can do derived stats for them as well, because for debuffs, but right now I haven't done that. And then status effects, which are manually being applied right now, not through spells and action and stuff. Is there anything else like non-UI? I added the horizontal wall game object, which is just a polygon and collider, and then I instantiate it in two different ways. A lot of the UI stuff will be changed though, so I'm not too worried about that stuff. I explained particle systems in a different video, so that should be useful if you want to learn how to do particles. I can even show them particles like this, where if I just go to battle and then undo, you'll see like some particles kind of like that. So if you want to learn how to do that, the other video will be shown. Yeah, I'd say that is probably the most of it. There's like some turn indicator where I add a new component and like that type of stuff. But overall, that kind of is the gist of these past couple of weeks that I have been working on stuff. I hope kind of this was just a good review on what we have done so far, but also kind of what I've done these last 2 weeks to make sure you guys don't get behind. And obviously everything's posted to GitHub. So that should also hopefully help you guys in understanding and dissecting the code. Please just don't copy and paste it. Just because it doesn't help you understand this stuff, especially if you want to pursue this stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of systems to stop you. Hopefully you don't. But yeah, so I hope that does it. I hope you guys, everyone has a good one. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, yeah, you can always email me or Rix. If you have a specific concern about my game, I'd probably say email me. But like Engine, always CC me so I can get to you, especially over weekends and stuff. But yeah, hope you guys have a good one. And I knew it was a lot today, but I'm glad I was able to kind of go big picture overview on it.